working? Yeah? Okay, good. Well, thanks for having me. So I'm Matthew Goldman. I'm the founder and CEO of Wallaby Financial, and we're no longer a startup. So I'm just going to kind of talk about, the story, and I'll start with my background. I've always been an entrepreneur. I started my first web company, so to speak, in 1997. When I was a freshman in high school, I started making web pages. So I made my first website in like 95 on a Macintosh with a modem. And I don't think I had a web browser. It was pretty exciting back then, starting with the web. And I moved into pretty quickly working with startups to help them do server administration. So I actually have a technical background, building Solaris machines, driving them to data centers, getting paged at 2 a.m., which I didn't like. That's why I don't do that anymore. So I've had a lot of different experiences, starting small companies, working as an early employee or first employee at some companies. I went to college, decided I wanted to go more to the business side of things, and became a consultant for a couple years at Deloitte, which didn't really fit with what I wanted to do, and decided to get back into the scene, and went to Greendot, which is now here in Pasadena. At the time they were in Monrovia. And at the time I think Greendot was maybe about 100 people, including the call center. There were probably about 20 business people. We were not making profit yet, but we were close to it. And it was really exciting because it was in financial services, which is an area that's always interested me in payments. And it was quite a backed company. I mean, Greendot's, I think, a huge success that often doesn't get talked about a lot in this area, in part because they're very under the radar and they're very focused on talking to their customers, not talking to, to Techstein, right? Or being in TechCrunch, which I guess also was new around that time. Seems like they've always been around, but they were a startup once too. So I spent a few years there and then moved over to yellowpages.com, which seemed like the most ridiculous thing I would do because it was owned by AT&T at the time. So I went from, this startup on its way to an IPO to AT&T, which at the time had 300,000 employees when I joined. But what was great about YP was there was a lot of people there who had been at startups, who would go back to startups, who would become investors, a lot of great network, and it was a really high growth company. And that's one of the things we talk about, what's the definition of a startup. I think Paul Graham says it's high growth. And so even though YP didn't have to go raise venture capital or whatever, I think we doubled in size and revenues during the 3 years I was there. So super high growth company. And it was while I was at YP that I had this idea for Wallaby. So the idea behind Wallaby was that credit cards are hard to use properly and people hate budgets. It's really kind of that simple, right? So there's been Mint and there's been Quicken and all these other budgeting tools, but like how many people in your budget, numbers would say less than 5% of you do it on a consistent basis. It's like dieting, right? Like everyone should diet probably, right? And should eat smart, but it's a real pain, so we give it up. Like we do it for January every year, and then we're like, oh, this is annoying. And budgeting's the same thing. Like Mint has very high user sign-up numbers. Everyone's like, hey, I'm going to budget. And they're like, this is hard and annoying, and they just stop, right? But that doesn't mean that people can't get more of their financial services products, right? Because they're complicated. Banks make them complicated on purpose, right? To make sure that they protect themselves, and maybe some of them are a little more malicious, if you will, in trying to get you. But really, it could be easier, and there should be tools. So I actually had one of these epiphany moments. I always thought this was kind of ridiculous. Like people would be talking about their startups, like, wow, I had this moment of clarity. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Like you probably were thinking about ideas, but I did, and it was at a gas station in Burbank. So you never know, right? So I've always traveled a lot in my professional career. When I was at Deloitte, I traveled every week. When I was at Greendot, every other week. AT&T, every other week. And as you travel a lot, if you want to be savvy, you start picking up co-branded credit cards and saying, I'm going to stay at this hotel and earn more points and get a free vacation. And I did some of that, not to a super extreme level. And then I also found that every time I landed at the airport, my car was out of gas. So, I land at Burbank after some trip at AT&T, and I drive to the gas station. There's a Shell on Hollywood Way at the 5. I know exactly where I was. And I swipe my Starwood Preferred Guest Card, which is a really great credit card. And I'm pumping my gas, and the sign turns on, right? The TV screen, it says, if you had a Chase Freedom, you'd be getting 5% cash back right now. And I thought, damn it, I have a Chase Freedom in my wallet, right? Like, why can't I remember this stuff? It's not that hard. I only have 5 credit cards. Like, I should be able to keep track of these things. But that particular card which is one of the most popular cards in the country. A lot of people have this card. Every 3 months, the benefits change, right, on the schedule. So you got to keep track of that. So I'm sitting there pumping my gas, and it was like $4 at this point, right? So I'm pumping my gas, thinking about calculating the exact amount of money I just forewent by pulling the wrong thing out of my wallet, and it was March. So I was thinking, okay, it's the end of the quarter, so how many, the whole quarter I've been doing the wrong thing, probably didn't, tell my wife, and why would she remember? So now we're both probably giving up like $40 or something, right? Just by doing the wrong little thing here, right? And then you think about people who are having trouble managing interest or managing fees or credit limits, and the problem gets compounded. So I thought, there must be something to help me. And I went out and I found like this one really terrible app on my iPhone that didn't really do what it purported to help you manage it. I thought, there's got to be a better way. And usually when I've had ideas after like 90 days, I come up with 25 great reasons why it's not a good company, right? Like the market's too small, or someone else is doing it better, or it's not VC fundable, or whatever the case is. But in this case, I couldn't find those reasons. And what we kind of eventually figured out, me and a couple of my friends who were helping me, was that maybe we could build actually a card product, which in reality we were never able to build, which is part of all startup stories, is that the only thing you know on day one is that all your plans are wrong, right? Like there's no way that anything you think you're going to do with your startup turns out exactly the way you expect it to. So we came up with this idea for this universal card where you would just magically swipe it, and on the back end we would pick it up in the payment system and redirect the payment to the right credit card. So we knew this would be hard. Coming from payments, it used to be really hard. And I knew it would require, real funding, because banks don't do deals with people with no money, right? That's just not a thing. So you cannot bootstrap a fintech company in that way if you're going to actually process payments. So spent the next 6 months thinking of things, trying to find co-founders, kind of went through a few. I think that's another part of starts that doesn't get talked about a lot. Everyone thinks it's like a magical story, you and your best friend from high school. And there's this fake Twitter personality. I love fake Twitter personalities. They're my favorite thing on Twitter. There's this guy who's fake Grimlock. Everyone know who Grimlock is? Probably not this crowd. He's a transformer. He's like the lizard transformer. Anyways, there's this guy, and he calls himself fake Grimlock, and he tweets really, really brilliant startup advice. And he's got like a book now. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. It's very Silicon Valley. But one of the things that he says is looking for a CTO, like meet one 5 years ago, right? Like it's very hard for you to go out and find someone to join your business when it's just you and an idea if you don't know them or have some kind of relationship or reputation. And even if you do, those things don't work out. So I actually started Wallaby with a friend and a friend of his, and we decided, I left my job. My wife was 8 months pregnant. Don't recommend that, but you can make it work. And I joined Mucker Lab, which is an accelerator in Santa Monica. That was a great thing for me because Will Su, who's one of the two partners there, I worked with him, I worked for him, I've sat next to him, in cubicles over the last 10 years. We had a really deep relationship, and I knew that he would be helpful. And something he and his partner brought to the table, which I didn't have, was experience talking to venture capitalists, right? That's part of the whole deal if you're going to raise money. And I've been involved in building businesses, but actually most of the other startups I worked at that were small were bootstrapped, right? And so didn't get exposed to that, and obviously at Greendot I was not high enough up on the chain or anything to be raising money. So went through the accelerator experience, which I thought was hugely valuable for me. I think accelerators like that are also a lot like they say about business schools or things like if you can go to the best, right? That's where you're going to get the most value out of it. So we did Mucker Lab, and we did our demo day and took a lot of business cards and thought, okay, we'll go raise money. And we weren't making a lot of progress. I'd met with it was easy to get meetings, right? It should be easy to get meetings because VCs are paid to meet with you. That is their job. The hard part is, will they say yes, right? So we met with a bunch of people. We weren't getting a lot of traction because people in the space saw how hard it would be to do this, saw the banking issues that we were just kind of trying to pretend didn't exist to make the whole thing succeed. And then ultimately what we did was went through a really tough period where my two co-founders left the company because they didn't think it was going to make it, and they had jobs they liked and mortgages and kids and all those things. And I had to go out and seek a new CTO. And at the same time, I decided it was time to throw the Hail Mary. And so we hired a PR agency, and we told the world that we had this awesome card product, and it would be launching soon. And we got really great coverage because it was a great idea. So we were like in TechCrunch and Lifehacker and The Verge and all these other sites. And that actually was the big inflection point. The guy who did marketing for us for the past 2 years always said that he would have told me that was the stupidest thing I could have done because I could have all blown up in our faces, but it didn't. so it works. That's part of being an entrepreneur, I think, is doing ridiculously dumb things and hoping that they'll work out, right? So that actually directly led, that story, like being in TechCrunch and having people who we wouldn't have been able to approach hear about us, directly led to us closing our first round. So one of the partners at Founders Fund read that story and thought it seemed cool, and we got like 10,000 people to sign up for a mailing list in like 48 hours, and back then that was enough. Now that's not enough. Like, don't fool yourself. Now it's like 50,000 is the minimum, I think. So we got a new co-founder, Todd, who's great. Still works with me. He's not here today because he's enjoying the fruits of selling your company. He's on vacation in Spain. So we partnered up and we raised $1.5 million in kind of August and September of 2012. And then we're like off to the races, right? We thought we have our money. We already had identified a bank to work with and a processing partner and all these things. And then once again, the wheels start coming off. So what happened was it turned out that our banking partner, we found we couldn't do a deal with. And they were being very difficult. They wanted these ridiculous things in their contract. And I think they thought they could steamroll us. And these are not regular banks, mind you, that we're working with, because like Bank of America obviously doesn't go work with startups to issue innovative financial services products. There's a group of small banks that do these kinds of things. And most of them didn't want to touch our product. And we found one who we thought would, and they wanted like perpetual rights to our software and stuff that we didn't want to give them. So we decided that, we already hired a few people and we had some money, so like, let's figure out what else we can do with the software we've been building, and we decided to launch a mobile app. So in about 8-12 weeks, we said, okay, let's just repurpose the software that was built to process payments. And we'd had some demos and stuff, and we launched an app on November of 2012. It was a really amazing experience. This goes back to another one of my investors, Jake Weinbaum, who's kind of big deal on the West Side. He always says there are no original ideas, don't fool yourself, which is really important as an entrepreneur, because literally the day before we launched our app, another startup in Michigan who we'd never heard of launched the exact same app. And I talked to the reporter at TechCrunch, and I'm like, please write about us. And she's like, this is ridiculous. I just wrote about this yesterday. I said, well, we're not copying them because I had to submit it to Apple 10 days ago, right, and wait for them to approve it. And so they wrote about it, and then, no kidding, a week later, another startup from Chicago launched the exact same app. And then a month later, another startup from North Carolina launched the exact same app. And given the timing, you knew no one was copying anyone else. There was no way for that to work logistically. Everyone had the same idea. Could we build an app to help consumers to better manage their credit cards, right? And we just said, that's fine, shows there's demand, let's just put our heads down and work really hard and have the best one, right? And I'm happy to say that everyone else went out of business. That's terrible, but we did crush them. I don't know if it's a huge market, but it was really great because we saw, the startup from Michigan pivoted. The other two, I think, never either raised capital or were side projects or whatever the case was. But it was another lesson, and just you have to kind of keep pushing through. And so we're making progress with the app, and we're looking for a new bank, and again, things are dragging on. And already, within months of raising capital, our investors are very frustrated because we're not making the progress they wanted. They wanted a card. We thought we'd have a card. There's no bank contract. We're spending all this money on banking consultants and building a PCI-compliant infrastructure that we don't really need at this point, and all these complex things. And we thought, let's just open up another product, like more software. Software is always good. So we launched a product we call Wallet Boost, which helps you find a new credit card to acquire, which was totally customer-driven product development. This app came out, and we always have a big focus on customer service. And our customers talking to us really helps us improve our data quality. And as a measure of that, like when we launched Wallaby 1.0, we had 300 credit cards in our database. And yesterday we had almost 2,700. And that's both our efforts and customers saying, this is wrong, and this is a card I have that you haven't heard of, and things like that. And that's critical importance. That is now a monetizing product line for us, just our credit card database, which I never would have imagined. So we launched this new product. We demoed it at this FinTech conference, which is among the nerdiest of things you can do is go to FinTech conferences. And, it was classic. The demo went really poorly. I got logged out of it in the middle. It's a live demo conference. That's the only thing they do. So like 3 minutes in, I can't, do anything, and I don't remember my password because it's a fake account. And luckily, on the plus side, if you ever go watch this video, they cut that part out. They're very nice. So you can't tell how terrible it's going. And then all of our servers crashed. Like we had built the software in like 7 weeks or something. It was like, we got accepted to the conference. We better actually finish building this thing. And so we had some traction that day, but we kind of blew it. Things were really slow. It was taking like 3 minutes to return recommendations instead of 30 seconds. And so then we're at again an inflection point, right? And this is like kind of early spring 2013, and we've got what we think are two great products, but we're not Snapchat, we're not Tinder, we're not on this rocket ship ride of users. We don't have a banking product. We started thinking really seriously, like, do we pivot, right? Do we just throw up our arms and like do something totally different, right? And we ran a bunch of studies and came up with other vaguely related ideas, and you're trying to like keep the team engaged and motivated. And then we had this inspiration that we should try to sell Wallet Boost to people, because like it's a great product, we just don't have traffic. So at a previous conference that the first conference we attended, where I bought like this teeny little booth, I mean, it was so small. It was like if I was standing in front of it, you couldn't see it, right? I mean, it was just like, it was called a kiosk, right? So you could put like your business cards on it and hope to stand to the side, and they put 4 of them back to back, so it's just a bunch of startups trying to talk to people. These guys from Bankrate came over and they said, hey, you guys are in credit cards, this is interesting. And we said, yeah. And they're like, we don't know any opportunity at this point. We had just announced that we were going to do a mobile app that hadn't even launched. We're like, great, exchange the business cards, move on with your life. And then we had Wallet Boost, and I called those guys up. And I said, hey, we got this product, and I actually think it would work for you. And so we ended up doing a commercial deal with Bankrate that we signed in October 2013. And because we saw that deal coming, and it was a substantial deal, it had revenue sharing components, it had upfront fees that we could bring in real revenue, right? We decided that would allow us to not pivot, right? And I think a lot of startups today are very fond of the pivot, right? It sounds super sexy, like, oh, well, Instagram was more like Foursquare, and then pivot, and look, now they're huge, right? And like, that's not every pivot turns out that way, right? And some companies end up pivoting multiple times. So we decided to stick to our guns and keep going. And during this time, we were able to raise some additional money through some debt and things, things that you don't necessarily want to do. You want to go raise a $5 million Series A, but that's not usually reality, and you kind of accept those things and figure out how to do it in the most efficient way. And then we actually ended up getting revenue. So, I mean, I can't disclose all our numbers, of course, but let's just say that in 2013, we had $5,000 in revenue, and in 2014, we had, several orders of magnitude more, right? Through one contract, right? And a few small things. And that was huge, right? For startups, revenue is so amazing because then you're not diluting yourself, and you don't have to go ask investors, right? And also as part of that, Bankrate decided to take a strategic position in the company, which allowed us to raise additional capital. They're very unconcerned about valuation. Strategics have all sorts of different viewpoints in the world, right? And some of our existing investors came into that kind of bridge as well. No one likes to talk about bridges, but they're everywhere. So people shouldn't be embarrassed by having to raise them. And then we just kept going, right? We kept building great software. And we were working on more customers and thinking about what's our next round and starting to meet with VCs again. And then Bankrate said, look, let's just buy you. That would just be easier for us. We have a plan to pick you up. We have the software we want to do. You'd be a great addition. And that's like the hardest thing actually as a startup, because I don't think you start a company to sell a couple years later for what, as one of our local angels, Steve would say, is a modest exit, right? He wrote this great blog post, Steve wrote about the curse of the modest exit, wherein actually founders do very well and are very happy afterwards, but everyone else can be kind of annoyed. Because, like VCs don't like that stuff, right? Angels may be happy, right? Angels getting 2x on your money in 24 months, like what a great deal, right? That's way better than almost anything else you're going to do. For a VC, it's like total crap, right? It's like they only want, 10xers or zeros, right? And they'd rather you go bankrupt trying to get to 10x. So selling the company is actually very hard because you have to have these conversations, right, with the VCs who are like, no, we'd rather you do X, right? Well, not that they're going to give you money. They'd rather you go find it from someone else and do the same thing, right? But it just doesn't help their economics, right? Getting after their fees and returning the money, and also you have to think about the weird kind of conflicting motives, right? So when they return the money, they don't keep charging fees on it. That kind of annoys them as well from a management perspective. So we're at this big inflection point, do we sell, do we not sell, whatever, and we decide time to take the chips off the table and go ahead and sell the company. And luckily, we had managed to keep enough control that we could do that, right? We could tell our VCs that we didn't care what they thought. And if they weren't going to write us a check, then they can just go on their merry way. And so we signed a term sheet, in the late summer last year, and we closed the deal on December 1st. And we're very happy with it. we were fortunate that we'd already been working with the people who we now work for over a year, so we knew them. We knew we had a shared vision. We knew that we felt the industry was going in the same direction, and we knew that Bankrate, our acquirer, is actually very acquisitive. They usually don't talk about a lot of their acquisitions. We're one of the exceptions. But they're very concerned about not messing things up for the companies. And that's one of the big deals for startups when you sell, is that you get ripped apart, right? I mean, that's the famous acqui-hire, right? And one of the downsides of the acqui-hire, even if a founder makes $1 million or whatever have you, is that the team gets split up, right? Oh, you guys are the mobile guys? Well, we have a mobile team over here, right? You report to Joe now. And oh, you're the product guys and you're going over here. And so what's great about our Bankrate deal, and great about Bankrate in general, is that they try not to do that, like very specifically, right? So everyone at Wallaby still works for me, and I have a new boss, right? And that's okay with me. I've worked, like I said, in big companies, so I'm not scared of that one. And I have a lot more kind of like corporate overhead junk, right? Meetings and whatnot, but the rest of the team, I think their day-to-day lives haven't changed, except they have better benefits, right? Which is good. We have our same office here in Pasadena. We're going to be hiring here in Pasadena this year. We get to keep doing what we've been doing. So it takes a lot of the stress of running a company away, right? I don't have to worry about making payroll, but limits my upside, I suppose. But again, I'm not complaining here. But you know, it's a tough decision, and I think ultimately sets us up, everyone on the team, for greater success in the future. Being part of a small team that was successful, right? Whether a VC thinks the return was high enough or not, we still took nothing and turned it into something in a very short amount of time. You know, that helps everyone's careers. And we're very proud of the people component. I think that, you know, that's one thing that startups have cultures, right, as they say. And some startups talk a lot about their culture, and we never did, but we're very people-focused. And people say that, but I think we prove it because we have never fired anyone, and we've never had anyone quit. And, you know, we're really proud of that, and we wouldn't be where we are without our team. And it's our job now and our goal, right, to keep them at the company for a couple of years, even though it's not the thrill of a startup, right? So at least we still have a full bar and a foosball table, right? The minimum requirements. But, you know, that's kind of the whole story. It's all about, I think, you know, what it comes down to for me, and you've heard this before, is it's persistence. I met with more investors than the average Joe does when raising funds for a company. I mean, I did almost 200 meetings to raise money for Wallaby, which is maybe not a good thing, some would say, but, you know, you got to stick in there. And we almost went bankrupt a couple times, and, you know, our deal got delayed with Bankrate, which had nothing to do with us, right? But that's just, they're a big company, they have other things going on, but you just got to stick with it, right? And we kind of pivoted around, and, well, we're all very disappointed that there is no Wallaby card, right? We were able to at least stay in the same kind of vein. We never threw out any code that we didn't really need, and we were able to pull it together and succeed, you know, together and be part of this community. That's my story.
Great story. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So I'll pass the mic to John. Raise your hand if you have a question. Please stand up, say your name, what company you're with. We'd appreciate it if you stuck to questions instead of advice for the speaker. That would be fantastic. So here you go, John.
John Schreiber with J2S Tech. Did you find that while you were talking to the investors that you had to change your own internal thought processes, your own understanding of how to convince them that you were worth it?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that I found when fundraising, I'm sure everyone's experience is different, is one, it's a sales job, right? So like any good salesperson needs to understand who they're selling to and what they're concerned about. That was a huge thing that I learned at Mucker Lab was, what are the economics of venture capital? How are partners compensated? What are their concerns and their goals, right? Just like when you're selling someone a fridge, right? You need to know what they care about. So just not framing it around what they're supposed to be doing for me, but what I can do for them, right? And that's, I think, a huge lesson across everything. We've just been interviewing interns for the summer, and they love to tell me how this job would be great for them, which doesn't tell me anything about why I should hire them, right? So I think that's kind of part one. And part two, when it comes to investors, is, at least in the seed stage, which is all I really have experience with, is much like the dating analogy, which is very popular, and I think there's a reason why, it's about finding the right fit. You're not very likely to actually pull someone who's not interested into a round. They're just not going to have it, right? So the best you can do is learn from them. My favorite investors say yes. My second favorite investors say no in the middle of the meeting, tell me why, and we go on our merry way, right? The worst ones are the ones who kind of drag it out because they can't make up their mind. But, we raised significant amounts from two major venture capital funds, Founders Fund and W.I. Harper, and we had commitments within 45 minutes from those guys. And again, this is not a $20 million Series A, but they knew that they got it, we didn't seem like idiots, and they knew they wanted to do the product. Trying to pull people across, sending them 25 emails has never worked for me.
Hi, Aaron Weiner from Bayless and Associates. As far as your modest exit, was it an all-cash deal? I mean, you're still in the company. Did you get stock? Or do you still have a stake in Wallaby?
Yeah, so the company sold in its entirety. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Bankrate. For all of our investors, it was a cash deal. For Todd and myself, we also have some stock in Bankrate. And there are, retention packages in the form of restricted stock units for the team, not surprisingly, because they want to keep people around. So actually, they're very, Bankrate's very focused on that in all their deals. And one thing that's interesting, I think, is that for us, it's not a metric-based earnout, which is a great deal for us because, it's unclear how our software is going to fit into the whole thing. So we're really focused on just building great things, and that's really about time.
My name is Mate. I was curious what you did to determine the fair value, because I know quite often that makes me very nervous. So if you could kind of share your process.
You mean in terms of selling the company?
Correct.
Well, it's like any other negotiation. It's just how high can you take them before they balk, I guess. I mean, I think it's really hard to value startups, right? For a company like us that had very little revenue, realistically speaking, and to look at like a revenue multiple is insanity. Also, most of our revenue came from our acquirers. It's also kind of not appealing to them. So it was tough for them because they tend to buy cash flow generating businesses. But we had a couple milestones that we needed. We knew that we couldn't just sell the company for very little and really treat our investors poorly or something like that. There was a line at which we couldn't sell, right? Because that wouldn't be fair to the people who invested in us. And so we just had to negotiate to the middle. I think that justifying that value is best left to some accountants that were hired right after the fact. It's really just a negotiation like anything else.
Morning, Matthew.
Hi, Andy.
How are you? Thank you for sharing your story. Question about the pivot. We hear about that often in startups, and I always struggle in the sense of building a company and executing a vision is hard. So when do you realize that maybe you're on the wrong track and you have to kind of redirect your efforts versus you're kind of maybe a little early and haven't quite figured it out yet? Or is there some arbitrary distinction between those two that the media has latched onto?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, and I think that I have a bunch of friends, right, who are CEOs, and some of them love to pivot. Like they hit it great growth, they hit a wall, and they're like, oh, that idea is dead. Better pivot, right? That just doesn't appeal to me. I think that's hard. So I think of what we not as pivots, but as shifts, right? In a broad range of helping people with their credit cards, we started on one side trying to process payments and ended up just doing software. But the full pivot's really, really hard because then you end up with maybe the wrong people. Your investors don't know what they bought into. There's all sorts of issues. So I think it should be a last resort, although now it seems to be a very popular resort. But I'm glad that we didn't end up going down that route. I think we would not have ended up in a good place. It's very hard to find an idea that suddenly goes from 0 to $1 million, the month after you pivot, right?
Yeah, Pat, thanks. You mentioned the other app companies that came on the scene within days. What intellectual property issues were there?
So we didn't have any. I mean, no one seemed to have patented anything, or there were never any arguments about that. I mean, we have received, like any company notices, that maybe we're infringing on something, and done our diligence to determine that we weren't, or we didn't think it was a big issue. But the other startups were like us, like a couple people just trying to start a company around an idea. And like most startups, you don't go looking to see if you're infringing on patents, because that's just going to get you in more trouble and take more time and money. You just go build something. And I think, like this example, so two of our competitors, like I said, I think just never really raised money, but one of them raised money and then pivoted. And they went more into using credit card data to help people find like good places to eat, like kind of like using that data as a Yelp stand-in. And so for them, I think they said, wow, we only got whatever it is, 50,000 downloads of our app. That's not good enough. Let's go do something else, right? And we just had the opposite philosophy, saying, wow, we got 50,000 downloads. Let's tweak it and see how to get 100,000 instead of like, oh, we should be getting 1 million already. But no one ever had that conversation, so I guess that's good. No one sued us.
Hi, this is Sandra. I had 2 questions. One, I want to ask you about the compliance issues that you had to deal with being in obviously a highly regulated area, and how you sort of maneuver through that. And also, number 2, how you maneuver through understanding it, pretty much similar to the financial sector.
Yeah, so, luckily for me, since I had been in payments before, I had a lot of background in compliance. And when I was at Greendot, even though I wasn't in compliance, I paid a lot of attention to it. And so I leaned on my friends there who are attorneys, and ultimately, you end up bringing people on. So we hired a consultant who's in the payment space, and we had some very specific legal help. Like there's this lawyer in San Francisco who's a money services expert who is on retainer with us and helps us through a lot of that. And then we did some things that are very unstartup-y. Like I said, we went for a PCI compliant infrastructure. So somewhere around here, our hosting provider Steve is here, and unlike other startups who might just throw their stuff up on Amazon, we needed physical hardware that we owned, and an auditor could literally go look and be like, yes, this cage is locked. Looks good, right? So we had to make some, oh, look at that. Steve's outside while I'm talking about him. That's terrible. So, but everyone saw it, so we can tell him no. So, so we had to make some different decisions that were expensive. Like getting a PCI audit successfully passed. We think we got one of the cheapest ones ever done, and it probably cost us $100,000 in real fees, extended hardware costs, and people time. And that's just something that we knew we had to do. So it was really tough, and we did things like pay more for our books, make sure our books are well kept, right? Make sure we were ready to be audited at any time, because we were really concerned. So we spent more on the finance side as well. And then ultimately, about a year ago or 9 months ago, I hired a former coworker from Greendot who was in their risk operations team to come in and actually manage all those policies for us. Because as we went into year 2, we could see here are areas where we were not compliant or didn't follow our own policies. So it's an elevated cost structure, but as long as you know you're going to do it and it's part of your plan, it works out.
My name's Bill. So going into the VCs, you had low revenue, you had competitors, correct?
Well, when we raised our first round, we didn't know there were competitors. This was all kind of pre-launch, seed round, yeah. So we're just it was the classic hey, I'm a smart guy, I have relevant experience, and I have an idea. Please give me money, right?
Yeah, so what was the most appealing thing to them, do you think?
Well, I think the thing about the Wallaby card was it was a very classic venture bet, right? It was kind of insane. To think that we would somehow wedge our way into the financial system and reroute people's payments in real time is a little bit ridiculous, which is probably why we never were able to do it. But if you are able to do it, you get data on everything that's going on in that person's wallet, right? You actually can control them, how they're spending their money essentially, and then you're paired up with this kind of barrier because it's very hard to get in, right? And so it had the hallmarks of a billion-dollar idea, right? And VCs know that most of those things don't turn into billion-dollar ideas, but if there's no possibility, then there's no interest, right? You can't go to a VC and say, no matter how good you are, and I have friends who had this problem, right, and say I know with 90% certainty I can make this a $100 million business. They just don't care, right? It's just not how their model works. So I think the biggest appeal for them was that we seemed smart enough not to get in huge amounts of trouble, dumb enough to try something really crazy, and it was actually possibly big enough. And that's, I think, the kind of juxtaposition they're looking for.
Any more questions?
Always someone way in the back.
Hi, great talk, thank you. Quick question for you. Would you have any advice for somebody who is for the first time trying to look for accredited investors, with a software company, a larger round of fundraising? Would you have any sort of tips that you would be willing to share?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One, it's thinking of yourself as a salesperson, as I kind of mentioned before. That was hard for me originally. I never thought of myself as a salesperson. Andy knows this. The first time I met him, I had a whole discussion with him about how I didn't want to be in sales. And now I'm a CEO, and that means your job is sales. You're selling investors, you're selling employees, you're selling everybody. So being comfortable in your own skin about how you sell, and whether that means you have to be passionate about your idea to an extreme level or whatever, that's number one. Because if you can't convince other people that your idea is the best thing ever, then you're never going to raise money. So you have to really embrace sales as a great thing. And then it's just all about networking. So we were greatly helped by being in an accelerator because they could introduce us in a very high quality way. But just it's kind of amazing, right? Every time you talk to somebody, you say, hey, I'm raising money. Who do you know who's got money, right? Or I see you're vaguely connected to so-and-so. Can you get me an intro? And sometimes you're going to get told no, right? They can't do that intro. There's some reason, but you just have to take every opportunity you can. That was my approach. It was like like I said, I had a lot of meetings, right? And that's what worked out. And also the more meetings you have, the better you get at it, right? I'm sure my very first VC pitch was like a total disaster compared to one 6 months later, right? Because you have to get really comfortable. But you just got to go out there, you got to meet people, and you have to not be shy about saying, I'm raising money. You'd be amazed how many people go and effectively do a pitch and never ask. Like if you don't ask, people are not going to be like, oh, that is a good pitch. Hey, do you want some money? Like no one says that, right? So you always have to come in, you have to say either at the start, you say, look, I'm raising money. Let me tell you about my idea. Or you say, let me tell you my idea. I'm raising money. Can you participate? You just, without the ask, there's nothing. Because you never know who your investors are going to be. People will surprise you, so.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so we always do a selfie picture, so maybe stand here and we'll get everybody photobombing you in the back.
Is this like the big thing? Can I go down a little?
Yeah, you can go down. All right.
I can fall over.
You get your gangster pose on. All right, you're like a rap star. All right, your marks all right, you guys got to do something fun in the back. All right, your marks, get set, go.